The story of the Fort Lowell ghost begins not with Fort Lowell 7 miles to the east of what was then Tucson, but with Camp Lowell, a small army post directly adjacent to a tiny collection of adobe buildings that was the old Pueblo of the 1860s. Familiarity does indeed breed contempt. The contempt between the United States Army and the dusty little town of Tucson was mutual. Whereas the saloon keepers and brothel owners of the old Pueblo appreciated the soldiers' money, the town overall was less than enthused with their rowdiness, which no doubt on occasion awakened the sun-baked burg from its chronic coma. This one-of-a-kind Carlton Watkins photograph from 1870 pretty much sums up the Army's position on Tucson. No period photos of Camp Lowell proper survive, but this image shows the post's walled cemetery, which had been filling up at an alarming rate due to contaminated groundwater. The water table at the time was quite near the surface and well within outhouse range. Many of the soldiers buried in the Camp Lowell cemetery had succumbed to dysentery. Kicking Tucson to the curb was fairly easy. The Army had but to find new digs, but not too far away, as Tucson was a nice place to visit as long as you drank only whiskey and beer while there. The man who made the breakup possible was Major Charles Ben Deer, seen here in civilian duds. Then Deer found a nice spot near the confluence of the Pantano and Tanque Verde creeks where they formed the Rillito River. Clean surface water flowed in long stretches far from the fly-infested outhouses of Tucson, as well as the saloons and brothels which may have been fly-infested too. The move was made in 1873, and the name Camp Lowell initially followed the post to its new location, and in 1879 it was renamed Fort Lowell. The separation was good for both Tucson and the post, as they could now live together but apart. This watercolor by Post Surgeon Major Joseph Girard depicts an almost idyllic scene of military serenity out in the middle of nowhere. Despite the summer heat and the Apaches, Fort Lowell became a popular post. Besides a large hospital, the remains of which stand today, there was also a large quartermaster compound through which supplies made their way to other Army installations in southern Arizona. Many officers and NCOs had their families with them. Seen here is the hospital steward and his son. In her book Vanished Arizona, Army wife Martha Summerhays recounts her stay at Fort Lowell. The officers' quarters in which she resided still stand to the west of modern Fort Lowell Park. Tucson and Fort Lowell maintained a cordial relationship. The Tucson of the 1870s and 1880s was not a happening place culturally. While Tucson was a destination for dissipation among the enlisted, Fort Lowell became part of Tucson's social scene. There was always a band organic to one of the units assigned to Fort Lowell at any given time to provide music for different events. Baseball was also a popular attraction. This 1887 photograph shows the visiting team from Fort Ochoas 4th Cavalry in their blue uniforms. The fellow in the white cap is their captain, Lieutenant James Brailsford Irwin, whose career included the Apache Wars, the Spanish-American War, the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa, and the First World War, in which he served as a brigadier general. On this occasion, the Oaxaca 9 trounced Fort Lowell 20-5. As it turns out, Fort Lowell as an Army post was about to enter its last inning. The Apache Wars over after Geronimo's surrender in 1886, the utility of keeping multiple Army installations active in Arizona territory came into question. The existential angst associated with the proposed closing of Fort Lowell is well documented in the articles of Tucson's two rival newspapers, The Citizen and The Star, an angst not seen again until talk of closing DM Air Force Base in recent years. This Star article from January 15, 1891, evidences local concern, though it appears to be along the lines of too little too late.
A meeting was held at the Library Hall last evening for the purpose of taking action relative to the contemplated abandonment of Fort Lowell by the War Department. The meeting was organized by B.M. Jacobs being called to the chair and Captain W.J. Ross being elected secretary. Several gentlemen spoke on the importance of maintaining Fort Lowell as a military garrison and as to the best means of securing this end. On motion, a committee of 5 were appointed by the chair to take such steps in the premises as they in their judgment deemed best. The meeting then adjourned subject to the call of the President.
This article appeared in the Star the next day. It appears to quote the Tombstone Prospector, though if it's a letter to the editor from some grizzled old prospector, that would make it super cool.
Fort Lowell should not be abandoned. What Arizona needs is more posts, not less. We are on the borderline of a country which should be supplied with military posts not over 50 miles apart at the most. The government should look at these facts and not allow itself to be blinded with the idea that all our troubles and future can be guarded by the home militia. Prospector.
Despite all the resolutions and protestations, the writing was most likely on the adobe wall for Fort Lowell as early as late 1890. Fort Lowell's officers and men seem to have been cognizant of the post's inescapable fate as evidenced by this classified ad from the Star's 13 January 1891 edition.
Furniture. For sale at Fort Lowell on the 14th, a lot of furniture. Apply to Captain W.C. Clarendon. Sale, for cash. At Fort Lowell on the 15th, 1 cow, 2 calves, and 64 hogs. Apply to Troop D, 2nd Cavalry.
This article from the 21 March 1891 edition of the Citizen shows that Tucson had to step out of denial and back into the desert.
The following order puts a quietus on all efforts to retain Fort Lowell as a military post. War Department, Washington, D.C., February 14, 1891. To the President of the United States.
Sir, a Major General commanding the Army reported to me that the military post of Fort Lowell, Arizona, has been abandoned by the troops and is no longer required for military purposes. I have the honor to recommend that the military reservation pertaining thereto be transferred and turned over to the custody and control of the Secretary of the Interior under Act approved July 5, 1884. Entitled an act to provide for the disposal of abandonment and useless military reservations, the same being no longer required for military purposes. Signed, very respectfully, Redfield Proctor, Secretary of War.
When the Department of the Interior took possession of the post, it sold everything that could be removed. There is a house in Tucson that still has a door from Fort Lowell. Even the Flagstaff eventually started a second career as part of a garage crane. Stripped bare, Fort Lowell was left to return to the dirt whence it came. Though, as we shall soon see, not everyone left. Word of Fort Lowell's closure quickly made its way down to the Mexican state of Sonora. The abandoned adobe buildings soon became home to a small community of immigrants that have become known as the Forteños. Though abandoned, Fort Lowell was not forgotten among the Anglo-American population and was a popular destination for outings, as evidenced by this caravan. The fort's new inhabitants, however, would eventually come into conflict with its spectral owners. The Citizen was the first to break the story on some strange goings-on at Fort Lowell with this 14 December 1900 article.
A ghost has come to Lowell. There is more truth than was at first attached to the report that a ghost has risen from the ruins of old Fort Lowell. Reputable citizens have told the story of their adventures with the ghost, and today one of the residents of Riedo came in to secure a quantity of ammunition for the final attack upon the visitor should he appear tonight. It appears that the ghost has appeared each night coming out of the ruins and fading away in the mass of adobe if pursued. Men have shot at it from all sides and it has thus far escaped. Last night one of the residents of the fort was within 20 yards of the ghost when it suddenly turned on him and fired a volley of stones at the pursuer. The Mexicans believe that the place is haunted and they are willing to make affidavit to the effect that they have seen the ghost come out of the ruins at night and disappear mysteriously when pursued.
Most likely miffed at having been scooped, the Star responded the next day with this dismissive tidbit.
Solis cum grano. Where has the citizen man been getting his oyster cocktails is the natural query after one has read the Fort Lowell story in last evening's edition. It would be a stretch of imagination to admit the ghost part of it, but when the ghost turns around, picks up stones and fires them at the pursuer, it becomes too much to be swallowed without protest.
The story picks up again with this 28 December article in the Citizen.
The Fort Lowell ghost was again seen on Christmas Eve when it emerged from the adobe ruins of the old fort and stole a turkey from a rancher. The ghosts of the fort enjoyed a turkey dinner at the expense of the rancher, but the sacrifice was not begrudged as ghosts who throw stones must eat even though but once a year.
Other accounts I have come across of this event make a peculiar contention. The ghost not only picked the turkey up, but ran into a wall with it. When a ghost moves an object from one place to another, it is said to apport it. This account seems to demonstrate an ability to transport a physical object into another realm entirely. A story this good simply cannot be ignored. The Arizona Republic up in Phoenix published the following on 8 January 1901.
A Ghost in a Well. The latest spiritual demonstration at Fort Lowell. Mr. T.F. Grindell, clerk of the Supreme Court, returned yesterday from a visit to Tucson and Nogales. From Tucson he went to Fort Lowell, where his brother E.P. Grindell resides, and while there, he made an investigation of those ghostly demonstrations of which strange stories have been told within the last 6 weeks. The most tangible evidence of the ghosts that Mr. Grindell saw was a Mexican woman lying at the point of death of a fright she had last Thursday night. She said she went to a well to draw water, and as she bent over the well she saw something white. It ascended the rope and stood for an instant on the edge of the well. It was very tall and of no describable shape, a dim outline of a human form. The woman's agony of fear was so great that she could not faint, but she watched the ghost cross swiftly to one of the dismantled post buildings. It ascended the wall and disappeared on the other side. The woman remained turned to stone, except as to eyes, heart, and brain. In an instant, the ghost reappeared on top of the wall, a little ghost with it. They slid down the wall and danced away out of sight. Then motion came to the watcher's feet, and she fled to the house and fell in a faint. Her friends said that she would never come out of it. At length she recovered consciousness and told of the horrid thing she had seen. As late as last Saturday, it was not certain that she would recover. Old Fort Lowell and its vicinity is inhabited by several Mexican families and 3 or 4 Americans. About 6 weeks ago, a Mexican reported that he had seen a ghost. It was afterward seen by a half-dozen other Mexicans whose descriptions of it tally with that of the woman, though nobody else has viewed it at such close range. None of the Americans at the post have seen it yet, though they have watched for it diligently. Most of them affect to believe it only as an illusion, but to the Mexicans it is so real that since the vision of the stricken woman, none of them venture abroad at night.
After several weeks of activity, the ghost seems to have taken a break, and the Citizen pronounced it dead in this 15 January 1901 article.
The Fort Lowell ghost is said to be dead. If a ghost can be properly spoken of as dying, it undertook to give too many performances and got run down in health and finally became so attenuated that no one could see it. And so in turn it gave up the ghost. That is how the story runs. The public will be sorry to hear of its untimely demise. A ghost is entitled to a full round of years and a large measure of popularity. Like a good lie, a well-authenticated ghost is heartily received in all lands and accorded the full credit of its station. The Fort Lowell ghost was a well-authenticated ghost, having been vouched for by many eminently respectable citizens whose homegoing tracks are always straight. And those who follow the motto of never speaking aught but good of the dead can ill afford to cast doubts on its short and troubled existence.
Not only was the Arizona Republic ready to bury the Fort Lowell ghost, in this article from the 19th of January 1901, it decided to call BS on the entire affair and have a little fun at the citizens' expense as well as that of Mexicans, semi-literate settlers, and perhaps its entire readership.
A Tanque Verde ghost. In comparison, the Fort Lowell spirit was a rank fraud. Recently, the Tucson Citizen stated that the Fort Lowell ghost was dead. The statement was made upon the authority of a rancher who lives at the fort. Since the obituary article appeared, we have received a letter from a subscriber at Tanque Verde who claims that there never existed a ghost at Fort Lowell, but that there is one at the present time at Tanque Verde. The Citizen prints the letter just as it was received from its correspondent, and it is as follows.
My dear Mr. Editor of the Citizen, Mr. Grassgreen, my estimable neighbor has told me that he has read in your estimable paper that the Fort Lowell ghost is dead. Sir, I repudiate that statement. I deny that the Fort Lowell ghost was ever legally alive. I assert that the only genuine ghost in this section of the world is the Tanque Verde ghost. I would bet my game rooster agin a fresh egg that the Tanque Verde ghost can beat the Fort Lowell ghost all holler in a foot race. I have never seen the Fort Lowell ghost, and neither has white man, only Mexicans, and their testimony ain't legal in Arizona. The Tanque Verde ghost is a genuine ghost because it performs in daylight. It can be seen at any time, and it lives in a house like any respectable ghost would do. No real ghost would live in a well, and no real ghost would throw dobies. It is beneath the dignity of any real ghost to throw dobies. You say the Fort Lowell ghost is a well-authenticated ghost because he was never seen drunk. Spirits never get drunk. After a man dies, he don't have to go out nights to get whiskey. He is spirits himself. I wish you would send a reporter out to see the Tanque Verde ghost. He is a white ghost, and talks English and Mexican, and lives in a house like a real ghost would do. If you will send out a reporter in the interest of science, I will not lick you as I would like to for what you said about me and my barley. Don't send no guy, but send a real man what stand up and shake hands with a ghost, and would not need a lantern and a carriage and a guide and a complete history of ghosts and ghostiness to help him out. This ghost is a gentleman. I hope some other fellers will change and be gentlemen after they dies. But do send a reporter what ain't a guy out here in the interest of scientific investigation. I sign myself respectfully, Simon Ramshackle, Tanque Verde.
The ghost again made its presence known in April of 1901, and the last factual mention of it appeared in the April 13th edition of the Citizen.
The ghost again appears at Fort Lowell. Some months ago, the Citizen mentioned on several occasions the appearance of a ghost at Fort Lowell. The story gained wide circulation, and even Billy Spear of the Republican in Phoenix laid aside his snake stories, which Judge Barnes of Tucson stores his memory with, and took up the cause of the Fort Lowell ghost. Some of the eastern papers printed the story, and Fort Lowell gained renown as the habitué of ghosts. Captain Ed Grindell, the sole commander of Fort Lowell, came in today and brought a fresh installment of the story. He says that the ghost has again appeared, this time looking well from the benefits of a vacation of 2 months. A Mexican resident of the fort saw the ghost a few nights ago. The Mexican was sitting beside his fireplace when of a sudden a gust of smoke came down the chimney and spread out into the room. The form of a man formed in the smoke and stood gazing with fixed eyes upon the frightened Mexican. When he could control himself, the Mexican spoke a few words of welcome in Spanish to the strange visitor, but no reply came. The ghost could not understand Spanish. The phantom vanished as it had appeared, taking with it the cloud of smoke, and no one has since heard or seen anything of it.
The Fort Lowell ghost lingered on for some time in Arizona newspapers, part trope, part gag. One article has Ed Grindell chasing the oil phantom around Arizona. Another has it moving its furniture to higher ground to escape flooding. After April of 1901, the ghost seems to have stepped back into the adobe for good. So, was the Fort Lowell ghost real? I think the Fuerteños saw something that permitted only them to see it. Paranormal activity continues at the site to this day. A residual haunting replays the scene of soldiers driving a wagon. Staff at the Fort Lowell Museum have reported objects moved around. Hard telling what might pop out of these walls.